Welcome to our Sun News special presentation on the crisis in Ukraine. I'm Faith Goldie. In part two of our series, we take the gloves off and tell it like it really is about Russia's real goal, Europe's feeble response, and we look at just who those so-called rebels really are. Who's calling the shots in this deadly conflict? One man. This is Putin's war, the battle for Ukraine. 3,000 dead, 1 million forced from their homes. The crisis in Ukraine is not your daddy's Cold War. Every nation of import professes Putin is the problem. Thousands of his troops are within Ukrainian territory as he illegally occupies Crimea, with tens of thousands of combat-ready troops along his western border with Ukraine. It is the first time since one European nation has invaded another since the outbreak of the Second World War. And NATO says she can do precious little, well, because Ukraine simply isn't a member state. But that's NATO's fault, see, and America's too. Up until very recently, the world stopped treating Vladimir Putin as our enemy. Instead, we pretended that he could be domesticated. NATO went as far as inviting the pariah Putin to their party in the past. His loot bag? Taking the NATO bids of Georgia and Ukraine right off the table. Moscow cheered and had the sincere decency of waiting at least a few months before they invaded Georgia. Now, Ukraine is the target, but not in the sense of a traditional military incursion. Instead of the Cold War, what we're seeing is a hot peace, if you will, play out in Eastern Europe. Asymmetrical hybrid warfare carried out by proxy amid a haze of propaganda. The war in Ukraine is a military, economic, and political crisis. Military help, well, it's not on the way. Economic sanctions are, well, at a standstill. And the only political body capable of concrete change was the EU. And it's demonstrating market reluctance to pay the price of conflict. In the meantime, summer military gains made by Ukrainians are all but lost. And Putin, well, he's more emboldened than ever. Vladimir Putin's new Russia looks a lot like the old Russia. A throwback to earlier, darker times of Soviet dictators. Imperial, bullying, belligerent, the Putin era has seen a surge of Russian nationalism and a massive rearmament program. Determined to rebuild its armed forces and recapture its status as a military superpower, Moscow is spending $730 billion over 10 years. There are plans to add 400,000 new troops to the already 800,000 soldiers, 600 new warplanes, 1,000 new helicopters, 100 new warships. It has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. Threatened, it says, by NATO expansion into former Warsaw Bloc allies. Putin's aim? To reassert Russian dominance and authority over what Moscow calls the near abroad, former Soviet republics like Georgia and Ukraine. The seizure of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula was only the latest. Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 was brutal. The first sign Putin meant business. Putin came to power in 2000 following the chaotic years of post-Soviet Russia. Putin promised a new era. Back then, Western leaders praised him as a partner. The grand plan? He would transform Russia into a liberal democracy. There was even talk of Russia joining NATO. But as his hold on power deepened, democratic freedoms were eroded. A free press snuffed out. Political opponents jailed. The true Putin has emerged. A bullying dictator bent on reclaiming the former influence and former territories of Soviet Russia. John Mraz is a Sun News contributor and an expert on Ukraine. He joins us now in studio to walk us through the latest military moves in Putin's thirst for land and power. Mraz, it's no secret that these are Putin's columns of tanks. Walk us through a little bit about his own movement within Ukrainian borders now. What are we seeing on the ground?
Let's begin at the beginning. This is the prize. He would like Kiev. He'd like it back. That's the new capital of Ukraine. The old capital, Kharkiv, I think he's more likely to take first. And by the way, I want to start this entire segment by saying that I think Vladimir Putin right now has every intention of taking most of Ukraine all the way through the bottom here, land bridge to Crimea, all the way to Kiev. Might leave this alone, remembering what happened after the Second World War, fighting Western separatists and banderas there for 8 years. Doesn't really need it. That's his ambition. As you can see, he's taken Crimea down here already. He's moving more troops in there today. He's using the excuse of NATO exercises, which are happening all the way over here, just 1,000 troops. He is using that excuse to move new troops into Crimea. Most military analysts today think he's doing that to get ready for the next part of the campaign. He's obviously had troops up here. Some people say 60, some people say 90,000 troops ready, heavy weaponry, heavy armor, all the way around this side. Look at the size of this border. It'd be like if Mexico decided to be with the RFA tomorrow and join Putin. What do you think the United States would do? Well, they'd do exactly what Vladimir Putin is doing. You would put all your troops on that border and you'd say, no, we'll take Mexico before we let that happen. So as you can see, it looks to everybody, and it's not on the map, but remember, this is an ally up here, Belarus. He can move troops up, down through here as well, pardon me. So what it looks like is readiness, preparedness, full-scale takeover of most of Ukraine.
He said that he could take Kyiv within 2 weeks if he wanted to. Talk to me, though, because a lot of folks, they heard about the Maidan. They heard that there was,
right,
folks inside Kyiv, and maybe they've heard of Luhansk, Donetsk. Where are some of the hot spots now that we're seeing within Ukraine proper?
Well, look, I was just recently in Donetsk. The heavy fighting has been in the Donetsk region and Luhansk, which is up here. This is where the rebels really took hold. I think Putin originally expected up here in Kharkiv to have local and popular support to rejoin Russia. This is a Russian-speaking town, used to be, in fact, the capital of Ukraine. You notice how close it is to Russia. That's the way Moscow liked it. And I think he also expected more support down here in Mariupol from local populations in terms of creating rebels, and maybe even all the way to Odessa. It turned out the only place people were prepared to join Russian military, and I assure you from the beginning there have been Chechen and other professional Russian soldiers, now regular troops, all fighting in here, heavy fighting going on. The armistice, the truce that's been declared is all but null and void. The rebels keep on picking away at the Ukraine military. Ukraine military then responds. You have flashpoints, both sides point at each other. Putin hasn't stopped yet. Fighting will get heavy here again first, but he could probably roll to Kiev in 2 weeks if he moves all of those armaments from the prior map and all of this stuff up. And unless we were prepared to fight a ground war, and that's putting Western troops on the ground, the Ukrainian military would lose, and very quickly.
I want you to get into that. Do they need the Western military? Can it be a fair fight between just Ukraine proper and Russia?
Absolutely not. I mean, we can take a look at this board, look at the numbers. I certainly wouldn't bet anything on these kinds of numbers. And here's the other thing. These 130,000, at least a quarter of them will be somewhat sympathetic to the Russians.
Wow.
Certainly won't want to sacrifice their lives on that hill. They will not want to die on that hill because they know what they're up against. And of these troops, hundreds of thousands are battle-hardened troops that have fought in Chechnya and other places. These guys know how to fight. These guys haven't fought anywhere since they were conscripted. Their fathers haven't fought anywhere since they were conscripted. You look at the weapons, these are old tanks. This is top-end machinery. You look at their air capacity, older model stuff. We haven't given them anything new. Russia constantly, well, look at just $76 billion to $1.5 billion. Vladimir Putin continually invests in his military, continually keeps them in training. They are ready, they're well equipped, and this would be a slaughter. So you can imagine that if it did start, the reason it could be 2 weeks is these guys might just not fight.
Now, take me into Putin's mind for a minute, because we've heard a lot of this Western creep. How is it that Putin sees this map of these countries just to the west of him?
When Viktor Yanukovych had to run away because he was exposed to be the corrupt assassin and thug that he was, one of the first things that must have occurred to Vladimir Putin was that he might lose his port in Sevastopol down here. That's the only warm water port that the Russians have 365 days a year on this side, on the western side of their map. And he wanted to make sure that he didn't lose it to, say, a new Western leadership that said, well, Yanukovych had no business re-signing that lease for 30 or 40 years. So he took him. Certainly, Putin's mind is that of a Cold War warrior. He's KGB. He's now been unmolested in power, wiped out every enemy he has within the Kremlin for about 14 years. And power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. He has absolute power, extraordinarily wealthy. He knows he's a criminal. But his whole mindset, all of what he's done is justified by the fact that this all used to be Russia. And he now regularly talks in his speeches about Nueva Russia, a new Russia. What he really means by that is a new Russian empire, not the Soviet Union informed by an ideology like Marxism or communism, but an expanded empire so that he could become Tsar Putin. There are many people who actually think that he would like to be named a new Tsar and just dispense with the democratic process entirely. And that he could easily make an argument to Russians, look, we were weak as Democrats, we're strong again, look what I've accomplished. He sure would like this back, but these are strong members of NATO. You have probably nuclear weapons, certainly you have shields up here, missile shields, you have squadrons of Western fighters. Poland's not going to be given up very easily, Slovakia, Hungary, but he can take Ukraine back. And he would always see Ukraine as just a province of Russia. He would never see it as an independent state, and I don't think he can bear the sight of it. As I said, I believe, and many people believe now, he will not stop, and I do not believe right now, despite Stephen Harper, despite the tough rhetoric, the economic sanctions, the rapid strike forces, I don't think anybody is going to stop him. I don't think we're prepared to.
Wow, I don't know if I can thank you after that or not. John, thanks very much for being here with us. Yeah, you're often right. That's what's frightening to me. Sun News contributor with us, John Mraz. Folks, stay with us. More to come, including an essay from John Robson.
I never feel such a strong, enormous support, but all the leaders of the countries, head of the government, and the representative of the people of the NATO member states for Ukraine. It is definitely a landmark event.
That was Ukraine President Petro Poroshenko at the recent NATO summit. Now, this year's summit, at which I was present, was slated to be the most important in decades. Over 3,000 dead in Ukraine, over 1 million have fled their homes. So NATO created what they called a rapid response force. Way I see it, the power plays, the real power plays, were done on the periphery. States acting bilaterally with Ukraine, not the least of which, well, Canada. It was during that summit that we learned of Canadian participation in 2 military exercises actually within Ukrainian territory. Now, time will tell if this limited military might will help to keep Putin in his place. And joining me now for more on the West's response is Mark Schweck. He's a past president of Ukrainian-Canadian Congress and current chair for the Euromaidan Canada Committee. Mark, right off the top, there are going to be people who are sitting at home who have donor fatigue, who have war fatigue, and are thinking to themselves, I don't want to get involved. Is it important? Is it crucial for the West to get involved in the current war in Ukraine?
Sure, I would argue Canada got involved in World War I, Second War as well. Why? Because everybody waited too long to stop Hitler in World War II. Everyone waited. He took country after country after country, and everybody said it won't happen. And all of a sudden, he had to draw the line. Canada had to get engaged. We could do preventive maintenance right now. Always a lot cheaper to prevent a war than to go fight one. Right now, Ukraine is being attacked by Russia. Ukraine is on the front of a war of Russia against Europe right now. It's not a war of Ukraine and Russia. It's a war of Russia against Europe. European values, democracy, good governance, normal university, financial institutions, free trade, and so on. Russia, what does it offer? Dictatorship, limited press control, no opposition parties. If that's the Europe that people want, then they should stand on the side and wait for it to get worse and have another Hitler. If Europe and Canada and the US want to have a Europe that's democratic, a Ukraine is democratic, and defend against Russia, they need to act right now.
Unlike World War I and World War II, we have a multilateral body that can go to war, which is NATO. Do you think after this year's summit, we saw them come up with this rapid response team, did they do enough? And Canada within it, do you think that we've done enough within the body of NATO? Well,
NATO has not done enough. Canada's been on the forefront. I wish every country was as good as Canada. What they should do right now is put a temporary base in Kyiv, in the capital of Ukraine. Do some exercises and rent out a section, or do some joint military exercises in Ukraine. Put NATO planes there and let Russia know this is the line that you can't cross. We keep talking about the line that Russia sets. Why does Putin set the agenda? Why doesn't NATO and the West set the agenda? Ukraine hasn't attacked Russia. Russia attacked Ukraine. And yet Putin is dictating the terms of the war, the terms of the peace, the terms of everything. NATO should go in there right now, put hardware on the floor, put military experts in Ukraine, boots on the ground if they can. If they don't, at least put some military experts in Ukraine. That'll tell Putin that they're serious.
Now, as well as being a military crisis, this is also a political and economic crisis. And some would argue, myself included, that the EU is really the best position to respond politically and economically. What has their response been, and has it been enough?
Oh, definitely not enough. I mean, again, Canada's led the way. The US has done a little bit better. Europe has been abysmal, to say the best. Right now, what they should do is, if they really want to get serious, these sanctions they introduce are very menial. What they should introduce right now is stop any Russian bank from trading with Europe immediately. Stop all people with Russian passports from traveling to Europe. Could you imagine 30 or 40 million people who want to travel to Europe or around the world every year if they can't travel? All of a sudden, what kind of turmoil that'll cause in Russia? What kind of opposition Putin would have? You've got to be serious about this. You can't go in increments of 10 or 20 people, sanctions against them every month or so. That's a drop in the bucket. That should have been done back in February. Today, we're at a serious point. Draw the line. Say, Putin, this is the line of a democratic Europe. You want to fight with Europe? We don't let your people into Europe. And then we'll see if Putin's rating's 82% or not.
I don't even know if I believe that numbers. Now, you mentioned the U.S. President Barack Obama said that geopolitically what happens in Ukraine doesn't pose a great threat to us. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely not. I again underscore the fact that this is a war of Europe with Russian values. Russian dictatorship is going to go into Ukraine, possibly the Baltics, possibly Poland, possibly Canada's Arctic. What will Canada do when Putin steps into Canada's Arctic? This is definitely a global war that's about to take place. The West can stop it right now, or they can wait too late and have another Hitler.
Do you think that our own Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, is aware of the fact that this guy is our enemy when it comes to the Arctic, that there is already a buildup of alliances, and that's what has informed his opinion?
I think partially. I think that is part of the answer. I think also Prime Minister Harper's, a student of history. He actually studies history. He understands the people of Eastern Europe. Canada can be a geopolitical player in Eastern Europe because if they can help Ukraine go democratic, that will influence all of the neighboring countries, shore up 5 countries that have borders with Ukraine, which includes Slovakia, which includes Romania, Moldova, Poland. All of those countries will now have a secure, and Hungary, and they'll have a secure border with Ukraine. Now move that border east. It's only one border to defend. If Ukraine falls to Russia, you now have 5 NATO countries bordering Ukraine. A lot easier to defend the one border between Ukraine and Russia. And I think he understands all of that, how big a geopolitical player Canada can be in Eastern Europe.
An interesting piece out by a young journalist by the name Ben Judah titled "Arm Ukraine or Surrender." Do you think that this is true?
Absolutely. You have to help Ukraine right now. And again, we could wait till it's too late, but Ukraine can defend itself, but it's been stripped of all its weapons, essentially. There is a huge 5th column in from Russia in the Secret Service that are destroying Ukraine from within. Ukraine needs technology. They need precise weapons. They're being blasted out of eastern Ukraine by the Russian military, which is very sophisticated and has spent huge money on their arms. Ukraine needs a level playing field. They will fight for the country because ideologically they believe in a free Ukraine. And by the way, they're not all Ukrainian speaking. Most of the army and most of the people fighting on the Ukrainian side are Russian speaking.
Kyiv, you'll find at the concierge, at the hotels, they're speaking Russian. But guess what? Russian support for Ukraine within Ukraine is just a fact of the matter. I hope we put our military might where our mouths are. Mark, we'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Lots more coming up, folks. After the break, a rebel roll call. We'll show you the men behind Russia's attack when we return to Putin's war, the battle for Ukraine. Welcome back. Some refer to them as pro-Russian separatists. Others refer to them, as terrorists. Who are the men behind the killing in Ukraine's east, and who are they really working for? Watch this. Decide for yourself.
They come by many names: rebels, insurgents, separatists, militants. But one thing is clear: they are doing Russia's bidding in eastern Ukraine, and they are armed to the teeth with modern sophisticated weaponry. Moscow has claimed it's a homegrown separatist movement of Ukrainians, but top rebel leaders, both political and military, have very close ties to Russia, some even Russian citizens. Several have previously fought for Moscow in other conflicts in the region. One group of fighters is known as the Vostok Battalion, reportedly made up of former ethnic Chechen special forces commanded by Russian officers. The group fought in the Russian Republic of Chechnya and later in the war in Georgia in 2008. As for rebel leaders Alexander Borodai, the self-proclaimed Prime Minister of Donetsk People's Republic is a Russian citizen from Moscow. He says he's simply a volunteer. Borodai was the face of rebel forces denying involvement in the shooting down of that Malaysian airliner in July. Borodai is alleged to be an operative for GRU, Russia's military intelligence, and has links to FSB, Russia's Federal Security Service, the new KGB. Also linked to both is Igor Gurkin, a self-styled commander-in-chief of rebel forces. He's known as Strelkov, the rifleman, and is seen here beside Borodai at a news conference. Strelkov has a long background helping the Russian military with service in Chechnya, Serbia, and Moldova. Up until last year, he was a reserve colonel in the FSB, Russia's Federal Security Service. Now, after a near rebel defeat in the summer, Russia has moved quickly to bolster Strelkov's forces with an arsenal of new weaponry. More tanks, more guns, more armored personnel carriers, more anti-aircraft missiles. All to fight an extended proxy war, an insurgent war, a new Cold War conflict in the heart of Europe.
Joining us now to talk more about the rebel ranks is Marko Stek from the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. Marko, has this been an accurate description of them? Are they just mercenaries?
Well, I believe that from the very beginning, actually, Putin made a big miscalculation. He actually believed that he can create an army of local pro-Russian separatists from the population of Ukraine. From the very beginning, he was financing the movement, he was sending the leadership there, but he actually thought that most of the membership will be from Ukraine. Initially, he got some support, but it proved to be such a complete miscalculation. It turned out that although Russian-speaking, citizens of Ukraine did not join at all the pro-Russian forces. So starting roughly in 2 months after of the conflict, he had to bring mercenaries from Russia. Actually, he was bringing by bus loads and actually by tank loads mercenaries, especially from the regions of Dagestan and Chechnya, people that he himself doesn't really trust very much. He was sending many people who were actually recruited through internet in Russia and were sent there. They were still not the regular army. However, the recent development is basically after the Ukrainian army or Ukrainian anti-terrorist organization started to actually gain ground very considerably. Within several weeks, they actually reduced the area controlled by the terrorists by 4/5. Only 1/5 was then controlled. He saw that there is no more chance. He actually brought in the army. The last slaughter near Ilovaisk was actually the army attacking the full force with the Ukrainian forces. But what is even more important is what happened in the south near the city of Mariupol. Mm-hmm. There were no rebels there. There was no fighting there. He just simply crossed the border. The Russian army crossed the border, occupied the town, established its own, and this is regular army, and they are poised to attack towards Crimea, to go towards Crimea.
Now, you're right to point out that all of those military gains made by the anti-terrorist Ukrainian forces have now been lost, yes, coming out of the summer.
Not all of them, but most of them.
A good yes, portion yes, of them, after Putin basically said, I can't win this in the fake yes, fatigues. Let's exactly, send our regular fatigues. Help me get into Putin's mind, though. Why the proxy war? Why send the mercenaries?
Oh, it's simply because, as I say, I think that he was miscalculating very much. He believed that people who speak Russian in Ukraine are pro-Russian. And
he's been reading his own media, apparently.
God, was he wrong? Mm-hmm. Because as you can see from various footages right now, much of the Russian army Ukrainian army is actually Russian-speaking. There are people from there, from Donetsk, from Donbass, fighting for their hometown, and they are actually extremely anti-Putin. They're not anti-Russian as far as people. They're not against Russian people. They're anti-Putin, anti this aggressive army that fights them.
Marco, this month I read a disturbing piece actually in a French newspaper by a top university professor in this city, saying that what we need to do is federate Ukraine because, you know, there are so many pro-Russian folks that are out there. They're freedom fighters. What has been the role of propaganda?
Well, why don't we federate Canada? Why don't we just decide for Canada? Why doesn't the United States decide for Canada to take Quebec out from Canada? This is really coming from the wrong person. The propaganda was at the very center of the entire, and this is Russian paid for and Russian inspired propaganda. It was Putin's plan from the very beginning to create federation, meaning basically to create separate mini-states that could be fully controlled by him. And this is unfortunately was picked up by some maybe well-meaning, but some maybe not so well-meaning journalists who are spreading this kind of idea. This does not correspond with the idea that Ukrainian people have. In the last presidential election, overwhelmingly 86% of the voters voted for presidents, not only for presidential candidates who have basically had the same pro-European on the United Ukraine platform. 86% of the population. Why should this population be told that they should federate their states?
You know, Putin was not the inventor of divide and conquer. It's an old theory, and journalists and academics that get behind it in this case better think twice. Marco, we're going to have to leave it there. You've been great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Still ahead, folks, the crisis in Crimea, how Russia stole it, and why the West suddenly went silent. That and much more when we return to Putin's war, the battle for Ukraine.
Has the international community seen any progress on its call for Russia to withdraw from Crimea? No. Has the Putin regime added its blatant and material support to the armed militants in eastern Ukraine? No. In fact, Russia even today announced a surge of troops in Crimea. Canada will never recognize Crimea as part of the Russian Federation.
Foreign Minister John Baird there with Canada's unwavering stance towards the illegal annexation of Crimea. Now, here to joining us with more on this subject is Constantine Men. He is with the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress. Constantine, you've been to Crimea. You know what it's like on the ground. Tell us this. A lot of people at home are thinking it's just a little pocket. Give it to Putin. Why should the world care?
Well, first of all, it's a territorial violation of somebody's, territory, especially of a sovereign country, independent country, as we like to call it. And basically, today it could be Crimea, tomorrow it could be Canada's Arctic, could be, like U.S. Alaska, could be anything. So if we just allow like one terran to get away with it, then we never know what's going to come next after this. And as has been previously mentioned, we're in this conflict, they're just starting. If we don't stop it now, we may deal with a bigger problem later on.
Now, Konstantin, you've got family and friends on the ground in Crimea. You've been in touch with them. What's it like for them right now under Russian rule?
It depends on what kind of mood they're on. So, like, if they're pro-Russian, of course, they enjoy it and they welcome the Russian regime. They welcome the Putin's government. In fact, just recently in Crimea, there was a summit of the Russian politicians. They were holding a conference there, and everybody was praising Putin, telling him how he should be the next emperor of the new empire, and how he should annex every single territory little by little as he goes along. Now, on the other hand, you have pro-Ukrainian residents there who are obviously terrified, and if you know Russian government, if you know their regime, basically there's no freedom of speech. Mm-hmm. So now as they consider Crimea as part of the Russian Federation, of course, all of the laws that Russia has are now enforced in Crimea. So that means if you ever say something against the Putin's government, against his regime, you can either get detained, you can abducted, you can be put in jail for a few days. So people are very careful in terms of what they say. Now, from the economic point of view, everything has become more expensive because all of the trade with the Ukraine has been shut down. So now they're transporting all of the produce, by ferry from the Russian mainland onto Crimean Peninsula. So this is what's basically happening.
And I've seen, images of people being shipped water, basically in milk bags, and I've heard even reports, priests have been thrown out of the church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church there, and that there are state agents who are basically in the back pews reporting to make sure that no one is causing any sort of unrest. Very quickly, though, what's the future for Crimea? Is it going to just stay part of Russia, or is the world going to fight to gain it back?
It depends on how the world reacts. If the world fights for it, then of course it might as well be part of Ukraine someday. For now, again, as our Prime Minister and our politicians here in Canada have been saying that they will not recognize Crimea as part of Russia, under any circumstances. Still, Putin claims Crimea to be under his rule right now, and again, as you mentioned, there are actually a lot of groups that are being persecuted at this moment. Ukrainian Orthodox Church, who else?
The Catholic Church?
Crimean Tatars,
Yeah.
the Catholic Church. Anybody who is outside of the Moscow rule or whoever is supposedly opposing them. So yeah.
Soviet Union 2.0.
Soviet Union 2.0.
Konstantin, we're going to have to leave it there. Folks, stay with us after the break. What's next with the West's conflict with Russia and Ukraine's future when we return to Putin's war and the battle for Ukraine? Welcome back to the Sun News special presentation, Putin's War, the Battle for Ukraine. We've laid out the bare facts behind Russia's romp through Ukraine. So what is next? Where does the West go from here? Joining us now to discuss further is Sun News contributor Simon Kent, coming into us from London. Simon, the question on everyone's mind, how do we stop Putin?
Well, to answer that question, there's going to be more ifs than a Rudyard Kipling poem. If the East holds and the Eastern Ukraine holds and there's no more incursions, then that can contain him. As long as there's no more, and if there's no more pushing on the other side of the country into the Crimea, and Vladimir Putin doesn't try and push out of Crimea into the other parts of the country will hold. As long and if there are good and fair elections at the end of this year, and if the winter isn't too hard and the gas keeps slowing and the oil keeps slowing, then all will be well. We just need one of those ifs to fall over, though, and suddenly we're back to where we started a few months ago, where Vladimir Putin will look like the aggressor, the rest of Europe will have to stand up, and let me say this, the rest of Europe will also have to get behind Canada and support the work Canada has done up to now, and I hope it doesn't happen, but may be called upon to do again in the very near future.
I'm hearing is this Cold War 2.0? Are we going to see a hot peace? Do you think if one of those ifs does not go according to plan, we're going to have to see a stepping up of lethal aid on the ground in Ukraine?
Yes, that's my simple answer to that, yes, because if we don't do that, the costs are too tragic, not just for the people of Ukraine and the eastern Ukraine, but the Baltic states and the rest of Europe. NATO has suddenly found itself in the position of being relevant. After 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, we've had a wonderful dividend of peace. NATO has not really had to do anything. Everyone packed up their armies on the Rhine and went home. But now, suddenly, NATO has to stand up and be counted. The rest of the world has to stand up and be counted. And everyone has to realise what is at stake here. We all thought the Cold War wouldn't turn into a hot war and we wouldn't see thousands of tanks rolling across Eastern Europe gobbling up one state after another as the USSR went across sand. Well, the USSR no longer exists, Russia exists, and if Ukraine was to go, or another Baltic state, look at Poland. Look how much Poland is exposed to Russia. You can see why they're nervous, and you can see why Canada is building up its allegiances with Poland as well. These strategic allegiances are very important. Canada will act unilaterally and bilaterally, always for the good and always for the best outcome possible for the countries at risk. Canada is going to keep on doing that, make no mistake, and the rest of the world will do much worse than follow that example.
You speak about strategic allegiances here, Simon, but I mean, part of the reason why we got into this mess in the first place is that Ukraine wanted to go to bed with the European Union, not be part of this Eurasia fantasy of Putin's. But time and time again, we've seen the EU shelve this free trade agreement. Sure, we signed an association agreement, and maybe we've got some good economic deals in the works, but I think the question on a lot of Ukrainians' minds are, why aren't we part of the EU yet? Are we going to see that sort of a strategic allegiance in the near future?
Well, we should see it too, because there's no point anyone trying to emulate 1939 and get off an airplane and wave a piece of paper and say peace in our time. At the moment in Ukraine, there is no peace to talk of when you look at what is happening in the eastern part of the country. Yes, sign that EU agreement, and while you're at it, why not draft up an initial treaty, a draft treaty if you like, with NATO and make the Ukraine an honorary member of NATO. Then you can invoke Article 5 of NATO's charter. You touch one member of NATO, you touch all the countries. That could be done. That is bureaucratic. Okay, Vladimir Putin mightn't like it, but if the business of politics was all about pleasing Vladimir Putin, everyone could go home and let him take what he wants. He's a bully, he will take what he wants, and he doesn't like countries standing up to him. So let's stand up to him. Let's ratify that membership, both of NATO and of the EU, for the Ukraine's sake.
Some people out there would say that even President Poroshenko is guilty of basically prescribing foreign policy according to even Putin's likes. We saw this autonomy granted to these regions of Ukraine. Do you think we're going to see more Putin appeasement? And here I'm even talking about the establishment in Ukraine in the near future.
Not so much appeasement. I think with Poroshenko, I think it's just trying to mollify Putin's ambitions, why he can get behind him. Poroshenko can get the world behind him and get the world aligned. I mean, we only heard a few weeks ago in Cardiff where they talked about this rapid reaction force for NATO. It's going to take a while to get these building blocks in place in Europe. Poroshenko is probably thinking a long game. Forestall the long game, but always keep in mind what is at risk. I don't think I could accuse him of really of appeasement here. I think he's trying to get all his blocks together before they can move forward and then finally stand up to Vladimir Putin and say, you touch us, you touch NATO, you touch the rest of the world.
Thank you very much, Simon Kent, coming from London. Well, folks, that's a wrap. Thanks very much for watching. Дуже вам дякую. Slava Ukraini. God bless an independent Ukraine, and God bless her freedom-loving people.